there is a moment, a thin, almost invisible boundary, where innocence ends and something far more terrifying begins. When we think of the word serial killer, we imagine adults, calculated, deliberate, seasoned by years of rage, trauma, or madness. But what happens when the monster appears far earlier, in the playground, in the classroom, in the bedroom down the hall? Welcome to Strange Love Files. Tonight we peel back the curtain on the youngest serial killers ever documented. Children who crossed a line most grown adults never even approach. Their stories are disturbing, unsettling, and in many cases, still unexplained. This is not a tale of boogeymen. This is the story of children who became predators. This is children of darkness. The youngest serial killers in history. Childhood. Society paints it as a sanctuary. Bright colors, imaginary friends, scraped knees, bedtime stories. But for a handful of young souls across history, childhood became something else entirely. A battlefield of impulses they couldn't tour, wouldn't control. Before diving into the rankings, we must ask the foundational question: how young can darkness truly bloom? Criminologists often talk about age of onset, when the first signs of violent behavior begin. For most adult offenders, these signs appear between 7 and 13, but the subjects of this documentary didn't just show signs, they crossed thresholds, acted on urges that even psychiatrists struggle to explain. Every name on this list committed multiple murders before adulthood, some before their teenage years. Our first case, Mary Bell. Our list begins with a case that shocked the UK and shook criminology for decades. Mary Bell, a child who killed with a whispery calmness that baffled even hardened police officers. But it wasn't only the killings, it was the chilling notes she left for police. The strange detachment she displayed, and the unsettling detail that she seemed to be testing boundaries, escalating with each attempt. Mary Bell grew up in a home filled with poison, literally and figuratively. Her mother was a known sex worker who allegedly attempted to smother Mary multiple times during infancy. Neighbors recall the Bell household as chaotic, violent, and deeply unstable. Mary was just 10 when she killed her first victim, a 4-year-old boy named Martin Brown. 2 boys discovered Martin Brown lying motionless inside a derelict house. Initially, police found no visible wounds, an oddity that confused investigators. They ruled the death accidental. A tragic fall, perhaps. But weeks later, a burglary occurred at a local nursery school. The culprits left behind chilling notes: "We murder Martin Brown. We did it for fun." The handwriting was childish, too childish. No one wanted to believe a child could mean this. Second murder followed months later. Mary's true escalation began with Brian Howe, aged just 3. Brian was found with injuries that shocked hardened officers, strangulation marks, puncture wounds, and a bizarre arrangement of injuries that seemed experimental. The signature element? The letter M carved into his stomach. But the deepest horror was Mary's behavior. Witnesses described her as charming and dangerous. The detective that interviewed Mary said she smiled the whole time. Not a nervous smile, a proud one. A child psychologist stated, Mary showed early signs of emerging psychopathy. No remorse, no fear of consequences. Just curiosity. Investigators revisited the alleyway where Brian died. Several children gathered, including Mary. But while the others cried, Mary pointed. "He's over there," she allegedly said, before anyone told her. This moment, recorded in the original statements, became the turning point. She knew exactly where Brian was. She couldn't help but show it. Mary Bell remains one of the most extensively studied juvenile killers in British criminology. Her calmness, her confidence, her eerie pride created a template that later profilers used to compare other young offenders. But this was just the beginning of darkness. Case 2. Craig Price. Craig Price grew up in suburban Warwick, Rhode Island. He was a class clown, a football kid. Always funny, athletic, and well-liked. Someone with friends, hobbies, and no obvious early signs of violence, at least none seen by teachers or neighbors. But behind closed doors, Craig's teenage years were filled with rage, explosive anger, family disputes, drug experimentation at remarkably young ages. At just 13 years old, Craig committed his first murder. He picked up a kitchen knife and walked to a neighbor's home. Inside slept a 27-year-old woman. Craig stabbed her over 50 times before slipping back home unnoticed. A detective described it saying, "It was like a rage storm. No 13-year-old should even be physically capable of that level of force." But Craig was large for his age, strong, athletic, and he enjoyed it. 2 years later, Craig killed again. This time he wiped out an entire family, a mother and her 2 young children. The force, again, amazed investigators. The bloodshed, unbelievable. By age 15, Craig Price had murdered 4 people. Psychologists warned he was one of the most dangerous juveniles ever evaluated. He joked about the crimes. He described them with eerie enthusiasm. Reenacted the murders for police, laughing, making sound effects, mocking his victims. At 15, Craig was legally untouchable, unable to be charged as an adult. He told officers, "I'll be out by the time I'm 21." That line became infamous, a chilling reminder that juvenile justice systems are not built for juvenile serial killers. A monster in a teen's body, but we go younger still. Next, Jasmine Richardson and Jeremy Steinke. This case is infamous, not just for its brutality, but for the cold, calculated planning carried out by a 12-year-old girl and her adult boyfriend. Their pact: kill her entire family so they could run away together. At 12, Jasmine Richardson became one of the youngest killers in Western history. But unlike classic serial killers, her murders were committed in a single event, not over time. Still, the psychological complexity of the case leaves researchers deeply uneasy. How can a child so young orchestrate something so cruel? Jasmine Richardson lived in Medicine Hat, Alberta. On the surface, she was a typical preteen navigating adolescence, attending school and living in a quiet suburban home. But online, she constructed a darker identity, gothic aesthetics, rebellious alter egos, and fantasy personas that masked her real age. It was in that digital world where she met him. Jeremy Steinke was 23, isolated, troubled, and immersed in a subculture of vampiric fantasy. Claimed to be a 300-year-old werewolf. To him, it wasn't just symbolism, it was truth. When Jasmine discovered him online, she didn't recoil, she connected. Their conversations escalated quickly from emotional dependence to theatrical darkness, and then into something more twisted. A shared narrative where they were star-crossed lovers, and everyone who stood in their way became the enemy, especially Jasmine's parents. Her parents, concerned but unaware of the relationship's depth, tried to intervene. They grounded her, monitored her online activity, forbade her from seeing Jeremy. But the restrictions only fueled Jasmine's determination. The more they tried to pull her away, the more fiercely she clung to Jeremy. In the fantasy that they were tragic romantics oppressed by the world, their messages darkened, talk of freedom, discussions about her family being in the way, and finally, chilling references to permanently removing the obstacles. For Jeremy, the idea was intoxicating. For Jasmine, it became a disturbing form of loyalty. April 23, 2006, the Richardson home slept peacefully, unaware of the storm approaching. Jasmine had already agreed she would help. Jeremy arrived, armed, desperate, and delusional. Inside the house, the parents were attacked first, brutally, violently. Investigators later described the scene as frenzied, but what chills them to this day is what happened next. Jasmine's younger brother, just 8 years old, woke up to the noise, confused. Scared, searching for safety. There would be no safety that night. He became the final victim, completing the horrific pact. Neighbors noticed something was wrong, doors left open, unsettling silence. They called the authorities. The crime scene left officers shaken, a family eliminated. And the one person they expected to find harmed or abducted was missing. Had Jasmine been kidnapped? Was she another victim? The truth surfaced quickly. She was found hours later with Jeremy laughing, kissing, talking about running away together. Their behavior was disturbingly casual, as if the nightmare from the night before was just another chapter in their twisted fantasy. The case became one of the most shocking in modern history. Jasmine Richardson became the youngest person in Canada ever convicted of multiple murders. Her age posed a haunting paradox, too young to fully grasp the magnitude, or old enough to form intent and act on it. Jeremy Steinke, unprotected by age laws, received life imprisonment. Jasmine, shielded by Canada's Youth Criminal Justice Act, received the maximum sentence for a minor. Experts still dissect the case. Jeremy, a deeply troubled man seeking validation and fantasy-fueled purpose. Jasmine, a child swept into a relationship far beyond her emotional development, yet disturbingly capable of shared intent. Together they formed a toxic system where imagination and reality fused into deadly delusion. Our next case is that of Amarjeet Sada. Amarjeet Sada is often cited as the world's youngest serial killer. But for accuracy, he's the youngest confirmed serial killer in recorded history. At just 7 years old, Amarjeet confessed to killing 3 babies. His victims included his own baby sister, a cousin, and a neighbor's infant daughter. The murders took place in a tiny village in Bihar, India. Poverty dominated every household. Illiteracy rates were high. Healthcare was scarce. Mental health was viewed through a lens of superstition. When his baby sister died, the family kept it quiet. When his cousin died, again silence. Out of shame, out of fear, out of cultural taboo. It wasn't until a neighbor's 6-month-old daughter vanished that villagers demanded answers. He was then brought to a local police post. He sat calmly, swinging his legs. The interrogation went as follows. Officer asks, "Did you take the baby?" Amarjeet replies, "Yes." Officer asks, "Why?" Amarjeet shrugs and replies, "She was crying." He then led officers to a shallow burial site. Villagers and officers alike reported one chilling detail. He smiled the entire time. Not fear, not confusion. A smile of fascination. Police described Amarjeet as smiling during his confession, a smile that continues to disturb experts to this day. Psychologist Dr. Hart stated, "At age 7, children cannot fully grasp permanent death, lest they are exposed to violence at a level most adults cannot imagine." Amarjeet's case remains one of the darkest in modern history. After his confession, he vanished from public record. Some say he entered a juvenile home. Others believe he was quietly relocated. However, his precise fate is unknown. When a child kills once, we call it tragedy. When they kill twice, we call it a crisis. When they kill 3 times, we are forced to confront a truth we desperately avoid. The next case, Newton Mahan. Long before modern profiling, before DNA, before criminal psychology evolved, there was Newton Mahan in 1929. At just 6 years old, Carl shot and killed Cecil Van Hoos, an 8-year-old boy, after the two argued over scrap iron they planned to sell. The boys had been scavenging for scrap metal in Paintsville, Kentucky. When Cecil took the iron Carl had found, Carl ran home, retrieved his father's 12-gauge shotgun, and returned. He pulled the trigger. Cecil died instantly. Carl was charged with murder, making him one of the youngest defendants in U.S. history. The jury convicted him of manslaughter, sentencing him to 15 years in reform school. But the sentence was quickly overturned after review by the Kentucky Attorney General. Carl was released back to his parents. Newton Mahan lived quietly after the case. He died in 1958 at the age of 35. His case remains a haunting anomaly in criminology. A child so young facing trial for homicide decades before juvenile justice systems and psychological profiling had evolved. Unlike later cases of juvenile killers, Carl's crime was not part of a series. He had one victim, but his trial raised enduring questions. How should the law treat children who kill? And can intent be measured in someone barely old enough to attend grade school? With this case, we see darkness does not wait for adulthood. Next, we have Richard Baldwin. In 1992, the quiet town of Groveland, Massachusetts, was shattered by a crime committed not by an adult, but by a teenager. At just 16 years old, Richard Baldwin murdered 15-year-old Beth Brody, a classmate and friend. The two teens had argued over a personal dispute. Baldwin lured Beth into a secluded area, armed with a baseball bat. What followed was a brutal assault that left Beth dead. The savagery of the attack stunned investigators. It wasn't a momentary scuffle. It was deliberate, violent, and fatal. In 1994, Baldwin was convicted of first-degree murder. The sentence: life in prison without parole, the mandatory punishment at the time for juveniles convicted of first-degree murder in Massachusetts. Beth's family, devastated, described her as a bright, kind teenager whose life was stolen far too soon. Decades later, Baldwin's case resurfaced. After U.S. Supreme Court rulings declared mandatory life without parole for juveniles unconstitutional, Massachusetts law changed. Baldwin became eligible for parole after serving more than 30 years. In 2024, Beth Brody's family attended Baldwin's parole hearing, fighting against his release. For them, the trauma of the crime remains as raw as it was in 1992. Richard Baldwin's case is now a focal point in debates about juvenile justice. Should teenagers convicted of violent crimes ever be given a second chance? Or does the brutality of certain acts demand lifelong punishment, regardless of age? For criminologists, Baldwin's crime is a chilling reminder, even at 16. Some offenders show a level of forethought and violence that rivals adults. The next case was never officially confirmed, the Párkány Child Murderer. Folklore or forgotten crime? Nearly erased from history, the so-called Párkány Child Murderer is a case whispered about in fragmented Slovak and Hungarian accounts. The story centers on an 11-year-old boy in the early 20th century, allegedly linked to the deaths of several younger children in the border town of Párkány, modern Trovo, Slovakia. According to local retellings, bodies were found with limbs positioned symmetrically, hands crossed at unnatural angles, eyes covered with leaves or cloth. These details led townsfolk to suspect demonic rituals, while others believed the boy was mimicking burial customs he had seen in church. A forensic historian stated, "The most disturbing element is how methodical he was. Even adults with ritualistic tendencies rarely display such consistency. The boy was reportedly committed to a mental asylum. No records exist of his release. But here lies the problem. Archival evidence is incomplete. Researchers cannot confirm whether the murders truly occurred or whether the tale grew from superstition, rumor, and fragmented documentation in a time when juvenile crime was rarely preserved in official records. Whether fact or folklore, the Párkány case remains a chilling entry in criminological discussions. If true, it would represent one of the earliest examples of ritualistic juvenile homicide. If false, it shows how communities under stress, poverty, superstition, and fear can construct legends around unexplained tragedies. Our next case was just as shocking. It is that of Jesse Pomeroy, another of America's youngest serial killers. Jesse Pomeroy didn't just kill, he tortured. Long before modern profiling, his crimes shocked 19th century America. His signature trait? A milky white eye, clouded by illness, which victims later described as, "It was like the devil was staring through him." In 1871, at just 11 years old, Jesse began luring younger boys with promises of cigarettes or games. Once alone, he tied them up, whipped them, stabbed them with pins or knives, and mutilated their skin. When caught, the judge called him a fiend in the shape of a child. He was sent to a reformatory, but jail did not stop him. Released after only a year, Jesse's freedom was brief. Soon, children began to disappear. March 1874, a 10-year-old girl, Katie Curran, vanished. Her body was later found in the basement of Pomeroy's mother's shop, mutilated. April 1874, a 4-year-old boy, Horace Millen, was found stabbed, slashed, and bitten near Boston. The violence had escalated beyond imagination. When questioned, Jesse confessed calmly. Jesse stated, "I don't know why. I just wanted to see what it felt like. No tears, no remorse." Doctors who examined him described him as emotionless, detached, and unmoved. Even when shown photographs of his victims, in 1876, Jesse Pomeroy was convicted of first-degree murder. At just 16 years old, he became the youngest person in Massachusetts ever sentenced to life in solitary confinement. He spent more than 40 years in near-total isolation, growing from a child into a man inside a stone cage designed to hold monsters. He died in prison in 1932, after nearly 6 decades behind bars. Jesse Pomeroy is often considered America's youngest and earliest known serial killer. His case remains infamous, not only for the brutality of his crimes, but for the chilling psychological profile. Sadistic torture at age 11. Double murder at age 14. A lifetime sentence that raised enduring questions about juvenile justice and the nature of evil in children. Next, we have the most unbelievable case on this list. You decide if it's real or fake. And if you like this type of content, Please consider a like and subscribe for more. Although our final case was never confirmed, it is still shocking to think of. The baby-faced butcher, aged 3, folklore or forgotten archive. This case defies comprehension. Reports from the early 20th century describe a 3-year-old child allegedly responsible for the deaths of 3 infants in a communal living environment, possibly a rural orphanage or poorhouse. The 3 deaths were attributed to him over the course of months. The unthinkable question, how can a 3-year-old be a serial killer? Researchers and historians have debated this for decades, offering competing theories. Theory 1. Imitation of adult violence. The child may have witnessed repeated abuse and mimicked it, not understanding lethality. Theory 2. Neurological anomaly. Severe underdevelopment of empathy or impulse control could have produced dangerous behavior. Theory 3. Accidents misclassified. Perhaps the deaths were accidental but repeated and wrongly attributed to intent. Despite the child's age, investigators noted troubling consistencies. Similar causes of death, often suffocation. Similar locations within the communal quarters. Similar timing over the course of months. A faded archival note translated reads, "The child lacks comprehension, but the acts show repetition and intent. The case's origins remain disputed. Some sources place it in South Africa, others cite India, referencing early psychiatric institution reports. Because records from this era are fragmented and often poorly preserved, the precise location and details remain uncertain. After the final report, the record ends. The child's fate remains unknown. No release, no follow-up, no confirmed institutional record. Whether fact or folklore, the baby-faced butcher remains one of the most controversial entries in juvenile criminology. If true, it represents the youngest alleged serial killer in history. If false, it reflects how early psychiatric institutions may have misclassified tragic accidents or misunderstood child psychology. Those who investigate child-perpetrated murders carry a unique burden. There's no satisfaction in solving these cases, only dread. You don't forget it. You don't walk away from a crime scene where the killer is still wearing Spider-Man pajamas and just go home. We assume children cannot comprehend evil. What? But history tells us otherwise. What do you think creates a child killer? 1. Severe abuse or neglect, a common thread. Trauma shapes the developing brain in horrifying ways. 2. Early signs of conduct disorder, cruelty to animals, fire setting, manipulation. These behaviors often appear years before the first killing. 3. Neurological or genetic abnormalities. Brain scans, in some cases, like Price and Pomeroy, showed underdeveloped emotional centers. 4. Environmental chaos. Exposure to violence, instability, or extreme poverty can warp a child's formative years. 5. Untreated mental illness. Psychotic episodes, dissociation, and hallucinations have appeared in several profiles. Yet even with these explanations, none of them fully justify why children kill repeatedly. The youngest among them seem almost alien to traditional psychology. Every expert, every detective, every historian grapples with this. Can a child truly understand murder? And if not, can they truly be a serial killer? The debate rages. But the victims remain real. The patterns remain undeniable. We look to children and expect innocence. But innocence is not guaranteed. For some, darkness arrives, early on, invited, unexplained, unstoppable. These cases don't just challenge criminology, they challenge humanity. Because if a killer can be born in a body no taller than a doorknob, what does that mean for the rest of us? This has been Children of Darkness, the world's youngest serial killers.